backstory on why we're covering this particular topic this week. After the last rant, I was pretty much strapped for ideas. Nothing was really happening the next week, well, other than the release of Metal Gear Solid 5, but I just got off the pre-orders rant, which was a really angry episode, and I didn't want to do another one in a row, which was just 8 minutes of me having a hate boner for Konami, so I decided to ask on Twitter to see if there was anything in particular you guys would like to hear about, and I promise not to make a habit out of this if you guys don't want me to, but I got a particularly interesting suggestion from one of my longtime viewers, so Slade, this one's for you, buddy.
Depending on how old or astute you are, you might remember the term middleware, also known as budget titles. This refers to any game that serves as the halfway point between indie and AAA. Those games that still present crazy new ideas and gameplay concepts, but have far more budget to work with than your standard team of passionate young devs, aka no budget. They're also typically produced by small teams of guys who have far more industry experience than your typical IT tech student, so the games that result are usually much better produced than indie titles, while still not reaching that level of graphic fidelity a team of 100 or so can push. Now on the surface, this seems like a winning combination, and in many ways it is. Some games that would be considered middleware are remembered very fondly by a lot of people, even on the critical side. But in recent years, a lot of these games have started disappearing from store shelves.
Middleware is dead, they'll tell you. There's no place in the market for it anymore.
And indeed, it seems like Earth Defense Force is pretty much the only surviving remnant of a once proud race of boxed on-disc experiences sold for a budget price. And whenever a new one does pop up, it's usually followed by harsh criticism, lackluster sales, and a tragic story of a company shutting down. At first glance, if you thought that middleware was no longer a factor in the market, sales figures would definitely agree. However, if Colonial Marines has taught me anything, it's that numbers are never a surefire sign of success. So where has all the good middleware gone? Well, let me tell you about a game called Shadowrun Chronicles. It's a kickstarted darling, and one of the campaigns that I'm profoundly regretting I was not a part of in the beginning. The series just launched its latest iteration for $30, and it's worth every penny, because it's one of the best RPGs I've played in recent memory. In fact, titles like Hand of Fate, Dandelion, Styx, Master of Shadows, and basically anything made by Devolver Digital these days all fall into this middle market price range. The difference is nowadays, they don't have to try to force their way onto a disc. Instead, they've settled comfortably into a digital format where people are more willing to, and often do, take a chance on them, and it's paid off dividends. In that sense, middleware never went anywhere, it's just changed form and adapted with the times, and the games from that category have flourished beautifully for it. And if we're really getting technical, you know what else counts as middleware? Basically anything on the 3DS. I'm sure I'm not the only one that can rattle off tons of high-quality games on that console that were sold brand new at $40. So no matter where you look, if you want high-quality entertainment for a budget price, contrary to what analysts may say, you still have that option. And everybody is better off for it. Better for us because we have competitive pricing, better for devs because they're free to make the kinds of games they want, and better for anybody just getting into the medium because it makes the cost of entry joyously low. Middleware serves too important a purpose to disappear, and I don't imagine that's ever going to change. But I feel like discussing the current state of middleware is only half the story here. Analyzing why it had to change in the first place also gives us some interesting insights into how this market and its audience work. Middleware couldn't survive on discs because the format itself put those games at a disadvantage. It was expensive for starters. Not including licensing fees for getting onto a console in the first place, you also have to sacrifice a cut of all your profits to the retailer as well as the console owner themselves, which, if you're making a budget game in the first place, are cuts you probably can't afford to make. But even more damaging is that putting a game on a disc gives the customer bias. It colors their perception by making them think of the massive AAA titles that compromise at least some of their favorite games. And when you fail to deliver on that, even if you charge less for the experience, there will be some level of disappointment there. This echoes a lot of the sentiments I made a couple weeks back in my No Excuses episode. People have every right to expect to get what they paid for, and if they buy a disc, part of them is going to want something comparable to the other discs they own. There's no real way to change this, as it's nobody's fault that most of those games are high-budget masterpieces that offer hundreds of hours of content, and more to the point, there's no real reason to change it. There will always be a market for premium AAA games, so they'll always get away with charging premium price. There will always be a market for indie games, so groups like Kongregate, GOG, itch.io, and Steam will never be short of contenders for their customers. And middleware has proven with its transition to the mostly digital format that there's a bigger market for it than ever. Companies are more clever than they seem, so when the consumer base starts to shift in its wants and needs, the perceptive among those companies are smart enough to accept which way the wind is blowing. All we have to do is sit back and enjoy the ride.
One other thing I want to address this week before we wrap things up, and yes, this also kind of has to do with some of the behind-the-scenes stuff behind this episode. The original draft of this script actually had a line in it where I was making a sort of mocking, poking jab at some of the big guys for not being able to adapt and change and profit for it like some of the indie guys, but the thing is, I'm old enough to realize that there's always two sides to every story, and so if I may play devil's advocate for a second, when you get that big, you're holding a lot of people's livelihoods in your hands. That's a big responsibility. So if you just go around changing everything because I swear, guys, this is the way the market is going, it's going to lead us to so many profits, number one, you're probably going to upset a lot of those people, and number two, you're probably going to get them all fired from their jobs because chances are your next project is going to bomb because nobody can stay focused on one particular direction, and the game is going to suffer for it, and so are your finances. Just remember that John Romero tried to do this when he ruled id, and it led to the creation of Daikatana, so it just goes to show that even a good idea can lead to dire, dire consequences if it's implemented incorrectly. So, you won't hear me say this often, but in terms of the huge developers and publishers that are out there, at least in that aspect, just try to cut them a little bit of slack.